Hello and welcome to Grody and Unprofessional. My name is Justin McMenamy, and my mission is to share both profitable and painful leadership lessons I have acquired over a 20-year career as a misfit in corporate America. In today's episode, we discuss one man with two legacies. Charles F. Seabrook is either the Henry Ford of agriculture that graciously employed the otherwise unemployable, or he was a classic strongman with a personality cult who, like dictators, clung to power even though it meant tearing his own family apart. There's also a third option. Maybe he was both. I'll let you decide. John Seabrook, welcome to the Grody and Unprofessional podcast. It is so good to have you here today.
Thanks, Justin. Nice to be here.
By way of introduction, you are a writer and a journalist. You're the author of 5 books and a longtime contributor to The New Yorker. I can honestly tell you that when I started a podcast called Grody and Unprofessional, I never anticipated the date that a contributor for The New Yorker would be a guest on my podcast.
I got the shirt on too, just to prove it, with grass on it.
So you are on brand. Our conversation today is going to center on your most recent book that's entitled The Spinach King, which focuses on your own personal family history and specifically the history of Seabrook Farms, a business that was started by your grandfather. The first time that I ever heard about Seabrook Farms was actually in a book called Play Bigger. It's a book about product category design. And your grandfather and Clarence Birdseye are both mentioned as the category creators of providing vegetables to people in the grocery store and a frozen food aisle. At one point, your grandfather was called the Henry Ford of agriculture and was a contemporary with Henry Ford, a very innovative guy. Now, that's the Wikipedia version of Seabrook Farms, but that's really not the focus of your book, Spinach King. Among other things, your book really does try to pursue a balanced, full-color look at the history of the family farm, about its rise and its fall, and looking at the lens of your grandfather, both as a person and a businessman. Would you mind introduce us to your grandfather, Charles F. Seabrook?
Sure. My grandfather was born in 1881 on a 58-acre vegetable farm that his father had basically hacked out of the brush. His father had been an immigrant from England, sort of Industrial Revolution time. And he hated farming, my grandfather. He didn't want to stay on the farm. But he recognized in the early 20th century, with the farms industrializing and mechanizing, he wanted to be Henry Ford and create an industry. And he realized that he could kind of bring the industry to the farm. And that was his vision. So, yeah, he was inspired by Henry Ford. He was 20 years younger than Henry Ford. He would build a vegetable factory modeled on Ford's car factory in the bean fields of South Jersey. He borrowed a lot of money. He got Wall Street to buy into his vision. He bought his father out, kind of cheated his father, actually. And then he had a great thing. He was immediately successful, but it didn't last. That the first iteration grew up around the First World War when food prices were high. A lot of people could make money in that environment, and food was part of the war effort, so it was also imbued with patriotism. So he did very well in those years. Also, he had a supply of labor coming from all of the Southern Italian immigrants coming into the country in the early 20th century. A lot of those people had come from farms or agricultural environments. They sort of understood farming. He did very well up until food prices collapsed in the early 1920s. He lost the business. He spent 5 years building roads, which was an interesting sideline of his. And then, he knew Clarence Birdseye. Clarence Birdseye had invented the flash freezing process. He had been inspired by seeing fish caught above the Arctic Circle and froze instantly in the air and then could be warmed up months later and tasted just as good as if they were fresh. And he resolved to duplicate that process in the laboratory. He did it for fish and for poultry. He couldn't figure out vegetables, and he knew my grandfather. And at this point, My grandfather is back in the farming business, and he and his sons, his three sons, work out a process for freezing vegetables for Birdseye, and then they become the major packer for Birdseye. And then after the Second World War, they start their own brand, Seabrook Farms, which is kind of where the company really took off from.
Yeah. You alluded to it, and you talk about it at great length through the book. Your grandfather was a pretty ruthless guy, not only to competitors, but also to his own family in many instances, a very driven individual. As you've studied your grandfather, how would you describe his passion, his motivation, his driving force behind how he viewed situations and how he viewed decisions that needed to be made?
He certainly was an unusual individual, and some of his success, I think, can be attributed to qualities which in other contexts might not even be that positive, but in a capitalist business context, in a ruthless sort of dog-eat-dog context, they allowed him to do very well. But, apart from the personality disorder part of it, which kind of haunted him later in life with his relations with his family, he was a gifted, intuitive engineer. That was one thing that agriculture really, it was at a time when machines were invented that could be applied to different kinds of agricultural work. But it was really up to the farmer to kind of create the application and then to build whatever gearing or whatever was needed around the engine. In his case, the first thing was irrigation. There was no irrigation in South Jersey in the 20th century. And, even though motors and engines had been around for 15 years, no one had really thought, we could use one to drive water up into a water tower. Then if we did that, the force of gravity would allow us to run, in his case, like at first it was an overhead irrigation system. And if we had an overhead irrigation system, then we would have crops when all the other farmers around us didn't during a drought. So it was figuring out how to translate what were sort of foundational technological innovations and paradigm shifting, electricity, internal combustion, the telephone, and figuring out how to apply those to moving a lot of product from the field to the factory, to the railroad, to the warehouse, to the marketplace. He was a great logistical, systematic thinker. The whole Fordist approach to business was vertically integrated. Everything from raw materials to the finished car is going to happen here. And that was how he approached it. So it was like everything from seed all the way to the frozen fruit package was going to happen here. The workers were going to live here. That was another similarity with Ford, is that he built worker housing, and he built a school, and there was medical staff, there was security. The only thing that was different from Ford was Ford paid them famously $5 a day in 1914. My grandfather was not paying people $5 a day. It was done on a much less of a budget, and work that was seasonal too. That was another big challenge he faced. You need a whole bunch of workers at certain times, but then you really don't need that many workers at all at other times, but you want to be able to get them back the next year. And that was a big challenge for a lot of farmers. And the way he solved that was he developed this kind of sideline in road building, which at first he did for the farm, and then he did for the state. And that he could do in the wintertime. That actually was a source of employment to keep these workers around so that when the harvest started or when the planting started again, they would be there. So I would say, logistical, being open to technology. He wasn't formally educated. In fact, he wasn't really much educated at all. He had really only finished 8th grade, and he took some correspondence courses for high school degrees. But, in terms of engineering, he didn't have any engineering degrees. So if it was a public work or a building on the factory, he had to get engineers to actually sign off on it. He was a great promoter of the wonders of mechanization and what it was going to bring to agriculture. And that was true of grain harvesting. Once combines came to wheat farms, you could have a machine do all the work almost. But with vegetable farming and fruit farming, because he grew strawberries too, there were certain parts of the whole production chain where you couldn't have a machine. You couldn't have a machine picking strawberries. You still had to have
Yep.
somebody pick them, and you had to have somebody who knew the right color and when to pick them. And I'll just say finally, the other thing that they did, which was truly remarkable, was they grew 30 different crops in the course of a year. It was like a ginormous vegetable garden, like you would have in your backyard, but it was 25,000 acres. And then they had another 25,000 acres under contract. And in order for that not to just become chaotic when things became ripe, they got a climatologist to come and work on the staff, a well-known academic guy who came in and applied his theories of climatology to Seabrook Farms and worked out this whole system of growth units, which was like a formula in which he calculated precipitation, evaporation, heat, all the different factors involved in a plant's growing from seed, and figured out exactly at what time of year you needed for exactly how many growth units. And farmers were even given slide rules to calculate how, and that allowed them to plan ripening sequentially rather than all at once, so they could move the labor from one place to the next and not get overwhelmed. That was the stuff my grandfather was really skilled at.
The heat units concept is still very much used in agriculture to this day. The other part that's interesting, you mentioned strawberries. To this day, even with AI and machine learning, there are startups that are still trying to solve the picking strawberries problem. It's still very much a hand operation because of the size, the shape, the color, the texture of them.
Right.
One robot can pick one strawberry and it'll smash right through another one based on just the force of it. You mentioned that very much an engineering mind, very much a product mind, very much a visionary. And I think like Ford and like others, that came almost at the extreme lack of attention or lack of ability on the relational side of running a business or the relational side of the equation. Do you view that one has to come with the other, or you see that archetype through other companies, Henry Ford, Elon Musk? Is that pretty much how it has to be, or are there ways that somebody can excel in both of those?
I feel like part of this is that it was a farm kind of culture and a farm mentality. In any farm of any size, you usually have the farmer's sons and then you have the hired men. There's sort of an implicit competition that gets set up, at least in the boss farmers, either unconscious or just actually conscious, playing the sons off against the hired workers, particularly if the sons aren't as hard worker or don't do things as obediently, don't follow orders as directly as the hired workers. So in my grandfather's case, I think that was always just kind of implicit in the culture he grew up in, when it was just a question of a couple sons and a couple workers. But as the company grew and as the number of workers grew into the thousands, that whole dynamic kind of played out in a much larger way. And he was a sort of a classic paternal, patriarchal figure, kind of like the men that made America great kind of thing, like a robber baron. He came of age really at the end of that era, the Gilded Age, when robber barons were still very much part of our culture. He didn't really recognize any checks on his power, even government or labor laws as they came into play in the 30s. There was a whole union movement at the farm, which resulted in a strike. He didn't brook any dissent of any kind. So anyway, so he did play I think, an inspirational role in some ways to his workers. During the Second World War, Japanese Americans were released from internment camps, and they came to Seabrook as workers. And even though their material circumstances really weren't that much better than their circumstances in the camps, they were grateful to my grandfather for giving them that opportunity. And then after the war, he had these Estonians released from displaced persons camps, and he actually sponsored them to come to America. And several of them have said to me in various events that I've been giving, your grandfather saved my life. Because
Wow.
some of them would have been sent back to what was then the Soviet Union, and who knows what would have happened to them. So there was a deep well of respect and admiration for him. And as long as it was coming from people who he controlled, that
Sure.
made him happy. Transitioning to family relations, where, first of all, people don't necessarily follow you that obediently, and also changing times in the business, new technologies. The whole Fordist approach ended up causing a lot of expensive overhead on the East Coast. And the sons kind of realized that they really should have factories in the West Coast or in Florida. But the old man couldn't handle that because his power center was all right there in South Jersey. And so that dynamic just played out in the most possible toxic way and ended up crashing the company. My dad used to say, like, if we'd only had a psychiatrist in the family, maybe, because he trained all of his sons. My grandfather, one was a civil engineer, one was a chemical engineer, one was a mechanical engineer. His daughter wasn't allowed to work in the business, but if she'd been trained maybe as a psychological engineer, maybe
She
that
could have
would
helped unwind some of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I've actually picked up a hobby over the last 3 or 4 years, and that is that I aim to read the autobiographies of a-holes. Or another way is the biographies of buttheads. So you can think of Ray Kroc, George Patton, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Elon Musk, these people that were very big personalities. And like you said, some people were massively inspired by them and other people got run over by them. What I'm interested is what is their perspective on themselves, on their behaviors, on their own personalities. I'm interested from your perspective, what foibles or flaws would your grandfather own up to in his own autobiography?
Well, I don't think he was happy being 5'8". I mean, that was one thing. Maybe he wouldn't own up to it, but part of the tension between him and his sons was that he was 5'8" and they were 6'3" and 6'4". I think the fact that he wasn't educated and he ended up in a business where most of the people were both college graduates and even sort of Ivy League college graduates, particularly when he got into all the investment banking and the
Yeah.
money borrowing. I don't know if he would have the maturity and the perspective to say this, but I think that lack of education and the defensiveness that it engendered really hurt him at a certain point in the development of the company when they needed to expand. They needed to have investment bankers on the board, and they needed to sort of set certain sort of like standards and practices that he had never abided by, but that the investment bankers insisted on. The reason that became so sort of toxic was that my father was an Ivy League educated person. And so when these arguments would take place in board meetings between my grandfather and the bankers, my father, he had the diplomacy maybe not to publicly side with the bankers, but everybody knew that he basically agreed with the bankers' thinking. And my grandfather also intuited that he had this sort of social relationship with him that he didn't have, and that caused a lot of tension. I would say that his lack of education was probably a flaw. What else? I don't know. The use of clothes in my family, the excessive arms race of English suits that was pursued by my father and his father and my uncle Courtney. My grandfather started that. My father took it and ran with it. He kind of beat him at his game. That's the other thing, is that no matter how good my grandfather was at a lot of this stuff, my father got sort of better at it, partly to emulate him. I mean, because I do think he genuinely was sort of in awe of his father. But there was also sort of a latent competition between them, that he would do it better than his father. But there wasn't a whole lot that my grandfather probably would say that were his faults. I could tell you that he had a complete basic lack of empathy, I think, that helped him in business, but it really hurt him in personal relations. I just don't think he was interested in much else except for success in his world. I mean, it was interesting, like the people he borrowed money from to build the original 1910s food factory, they were these aristocratic New Yorkers who had a place up in the Adirondacks where all those robber baron people would go in the summer times, and they fly fished and they gave money to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and they were patrons of the arts. He was never anything like that. He didn't have any interest, really. I mean, he's kind of interested in listening to choral music, but no pastimes, no hobbies, no sort of courses of study that interested him. It was really always just about his success in the world.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm interested, as you think about your grandfather, is it a cocktail of arrogance and insecurity that leads to some of these behaviors? Because we talk about, like, he's very confident in his technical components, but then you alluded to kind of a social insecurity of feeling, maybe because he was 5'8", being looked down upon both physically and socially. What is that cocktail of arrogance and insecurity that you see in your grandfather?
for sure, it was driven by insecurity. He was insecure just about having that much money and what really you should do with it. You're talking about someone, it wasn't like he was born poor. His father was a pretty successful farmer, but, he was very working class. And then my grandfather went all the way, he kind of skipped the middle class altogether and was, hanging out in the engineers club with people like Andrew Carnegie within his lifetime. And so he transited basically two whole levels of class, from working class to upper class, skipped the middle. I think he was very insecure about being caught out. Philadelphia was the social world for my ancestors. New York, they would go to New York, but New York's kind of anything goes kind of town. If you're a comer and a mover and a shaker, you really don't need a pedigree or a pass. But in Philadelphia, people do take that stuff seriously. They're like the old line, main line Quaker people that go back to William Penn. They bought stock in the Pennsylvania Railroad and they passed it down. And that was like the greatest railroad in the world for 100 years until it all fell apart at Penn Central in the 1960s. And my father was actually on the board of Penn Central then. So that society was very stuffy and snobby. And I'm sure they invited my grandfather to social events, but he wasn't really presentable, really. Sure. And all he wanted to talk about was business. So I think he felt like they kind of looked down on him, and they probably did look down on him. It was interesting that when I talk about the Grace Kelly wedding in my book, because that was where my parents met, and there's a scene where my father's over at my grandfather's house, and the telephone rings, and he goes to take a call, and he comes back to say that he has been invited to Grace Kelly's wedding, but it was really my grandfather who was contemporaries with Grace Kelly's parents. Jack Kelly was this famous contractor in Philadelphia who built the power plant at Seabrook Farms, and their business relationship. And he was kind of a Henry Ford type figure in his own way, and a patriarch of like this big family of people. And so the fact that my father was invited to the wedding and not my grandfather sort of, I think, tells you that my father was a very charming and well-polished man. My grandfather was very rough around the edges, and the Kellys preferred to have my father at the wedding and not my grandfather.
You get into, in the book, the relationship between your grandfather and your father is very rough. It was difficult. Ultimately, your grandfather chose to scuttle the company rather than hand it to your father. Having read through a number of famous companies from that era, it's a very similar situation with the Bush family. August Bush, 3, selling the company out from under 4. Edsel and Henry Ford famously had a very contentious relationship. Yep. Have you spent much time studying the repetitive nature of this personality type and this archetype? It was interesting as I was studying it. It seems like it is a pattern that repeated either in that era, but I think probably more accurately, it repeats over and over again as companies move from that pioneering bulldog first generation that just refuses to let go of the chain even after it's long past time to let go.
And in each of those companies, Bush and Ford and Seabrook, you've got the brand is the family name, you know,
Yep.
and I think that's important as opposed to, well, Birdseye, but Birdseye his patents were bought by General Foods. It was never like Birdseye's company. But in the case of Bush and Ford and Seabrook, you've got the family who controls the company, and the brand story becomes the family story. And at least in the case of the Seabrooks, that was sort of their special sauce, that when they went into competition with Birdseye, then Green Giant, in fact, there was a real family that did this and did it on a family farm where they had grown up, was a potent marketing publicity device. And they relied on it, leaned on it whenever they could, and they got a lot of publicity. They were frequently the famous Seabrook family with the father and the brothers and the sons, and they all work together. And it's sort of like ideal American capitalist family. They were frequently written about, and it culminated actually in this 4-page Life magazine feature that was done in the middle of the 50s. It was a special food issue. It featured Seabrook's technology. It was a huge coup for the company. And actually, General Foods, the owner of Birdseye, was a big advertiser in Life magazine. And they went ballistic when they saw that their competitor got 4 editorial pages for free, which is like the best form of advertising. So,
Sure.
But I think that ended up confusing love and money in some way in the family, that what was loved or what was respected about the individuals was not necessarily their special qualities, but what qualities helped the brand. And if they had qualities that didn't help the brand, then they didn't get the same love or attention from my grandfather. They actually got criticized pretty severely by my grandfather. There was this unattainable, ideal family mythology that grew up around my family, and the workers have contributed to that. There's actually a museum still there that the workers created that put that mythology into brick and mortar. I think that's probably also true of Ford, that Edsel, he really wanted to work for his father. He had innovative ideas. They didn't always work out, but his father judged him by this impossible standard that Edsel could never live up to. I think part of it is that we live in a culture where individual, like realizing who you are, like finding your truth, that's seen as the highest form of personal growth. And often that means if you exist in a family business, you have to either go against what the founder wants, or you have to give up on some of your dreams and submit. Either way, I think it causes latent tensions. Maybe they don't appear always right away, but eventually they find themselves. And then when they do explode, it's usually the end of the business, or the next generation inherits from that explosion. It doesn't last that long. In Europe, you get family businesses that last longer, like the fashion houses or the leather companies that go back to the Middle Ages. That's unthinkable. Can you imagine like a 500-year business in America?
Yeah, a friend of mine is a CEO of an agriculture company in Germany, and he talks about this to some extent. He says, the Americans are very, very focused on the time value of money. If somebody walks up and offers you $250 million for your company, and you're a family-owned business, you're the founder, you go to the math tables and you figure out, what can I do with $250 million and where could I invest it and what could I do with it? He said, for me, as a second headed to third generation company, I'm more interested in the legacy. I'm more interested in, this is the house that my grandfather built, And he said, I live in a house built 250 years ago. The house is not for sale. It will be here for another 250 years. And so he himself highlights this difference of there are things in his life that just flat out are not for sale. As you highlighted more, the American capitalist mindset is to say, everything's for sale for a price. You just got to meet that price. You talk about this event that is pretty impactful, not only in your family legacy, but it's the decision by your grandfather to sell the business rather than to have your father be the CEO. And as it reads very similar to the decision of Anheuser-Busch to sell to InBev. It was lack of faith in the next generation and wanting to capitalize. And maybe I don't want to give power away because I was the end all be all. Talk to me about what you think your grandfather's mindset was, because you also mentioned he might have been impaired from a stroke that had happened 10, 15 years earlier. And then also the impact to your father, who had invested his entire professional life into building Seabrook Farms, to have it pulled from him right there at what would have been the peak of his career.
Yeah, it was tragic. My father was the youngest of the three brothers. He was 11 years younger than his oldest brother, so it's quite a lot of time between them. And early on, my grandfather said to my father, you're going to be the successor. In fact, he said it to him when he was 22 years old, right after he came home from college. He took him and gave him a whole spiel about how I've only got 10 years left. You're going to have to learn everything, and then you're going to run the business. Maybe he had said that to some of his brothers too when they graduated from college, but by that point, his oldest brother had butted heads with his father for 10 years. And then when the Second World War started, his oldest brother, Belford, enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, and their father went ballistic. Their father saw that as a betrayal of him and of the company, that he would actually go and fight for his country. And in fact, my grandfather brought that attitude. He basically made it known that any worker who wanted an exemption as an agricultural worker could come to him and he would sign the papers. And so all these mothers were saying, please keep my son out of the war. The war board in town they refused to honor these requests because they knew that my grandfather had this mindset where he saw himself as more important than fighting the Nazis,
Sure.
And freedom. That tells you a fair amount. But anyway, so my grandfather, he anointed my father early on, and it's unclear exactly how his attitude changed. Like I said earlier, he cheated his father out of his land. He often said to his sons when he was in a more lucid frame of mind that he was haunted by that the guilt of it, and then the paranoia that his sons would do the same thing to him affected his mind. But in fact, the sons basically did do the same thing to him when the bankers said to the sons around 1956, your father is out of control. He's running the business into the ground. If you don't find a way to remove him from the business, we're going to call our loans and bankrupt the company. And one of the advisors said the way to do it is just to have him committed. And so that's what they did. They took him to Philadelphia on the pretense of a doctor's visit, and they left him, and he was confined. But eventually my aunt, my father's sister, said, I can't support this. And then their mother was also wavering, and so he got out. And then that's when he sold the company and disowned his sons. He said to the new owner of the company, the only condition is you can't hire my son Jack to run the company. And that's the first thing the guy did. He went to my father and said, please come and run the company because no one else can run it except for you. My father, at this point, he's 40 years old. Yeah, he's devoted his whole life to Seabrook Farms. He's also kind of a big shot in the food industry, and it mainly now kind of California based. He gets offers from a couple of very big food corporations to go and work for them. But he didn't want to leave that area. He was interested in horses, and he wanted to live in a place where he could have horses. And although he declined to work for the company, he never went back to that business. We stayed in the area. My grandfather kicked us out of our house. I was like 9 months old at that point. That was another way of he controlled his sons, is he insisted they live in houses that he owned so that he could basically tell them like what to do in their living situation, and he could just walk in without even asking to. I mean, he treated everything like it was his. Eventually, my father found work in Philadelphia. He had a lot of business contacts from being at Seabrook Farms and bankers and such. So he did well, but I know he always regretted it. They were foundational pioneers of fast frozen food, and then of like the Mylar bag in the mid-50s that allows you to do prepared foods like cream spinach with butter and salt, and then seal it all up in the Mylar bag before it left the factory, or even like TV dinners became a thing. They were there right at the beginning of all that. Frozen orange juice, frozen concentrated orange juice. My father wanted to expand into orange groves in Florida. My grandfather absolutely refused. It wasn't their business. So I think he would have grown the company to great heights, and I think he knew that, and I think he regretted it. Although he did well, he didn't have like his own company. It was having your name on the company. It was like your people. It was where you grew up. And you got to go there. I mean, I was there just over last weekend. I went to give a presentation in Seabrook, New Jersey, which is still there. And there's still a lot of people there who are somehow connected to the company. Usually now it's their parents, because most of those folks are gone. But I met the 97-year-old woman who talked to me about all the different jobs she did at the company. And so many people have associations with it that whenever I go, I'm sort of like surrounded by these people that want to talk to me about their Seabrook experiences. Yeah.
Right. One of my questions is for you personally. This is a very personal book for you, and in many ways it's kind of a tell-all book. It's meant, I think, from reading it, to balance some of the public whitewashed persona that maybe your grandfather was given in these magazines and in these articles. And so it very much is meant to show some of the darker side of his personality, some of the darker side of his actions, some of the darker side of the business. I, too, have experienced some stuff in my life that was negative, and through Grody and Unprofessional and through writing on LinkedIn and other places, I've tried to write about those things as well. For me, as I was starting, the calculus that I ran through was I chose not to name the vagrants and the villains. I wanted to talk about the instance, but not draw the names out into the public. And for me, it wasn't that I was afraid of that person. For me, it was the fear of the calcification of bitterness. That if I told the story more generically, I could personally move past from it versus being captive to the prison of the past. Not all of that directly applies to you personally, but I was very interested as I was reading the book, the calculus that went into researching and authoring a book that for you, as you mentioned, is a very personal, even in the book you mention about this instance you had with your grandfather. And the purpose of the book is in some ways to get transgenerational revenge on your grandfather. Talk to me about the emotional journey and the calculus of deciding to write The Spinach King.
Yeah, it was a hard book to even decide to write, partly because, as you say, there was this already existing mythologized narrative which gave a lot of families hope and was kind of incorporated into their family stories. My grandfather was this kind of humanitarian capitalist. As one worker put it, a man with a head for business but a heart for people. I took seriously the role that narrative played in their lives. Yeah, and as you also say, revenge. A lot of this stuff I didn't know until my father died. When my father died, he left me these like 3 boxes of materials that I had never heard of before. When my grandfather died in 1964, my father and his brothers had decided to have the will thrown out, to try to have the will thrown out, arguing that he was insane when he made it. And so to prove that, they had done all these interviews with people around him. people who had sort of observed him in his day-to-day life. And even though the lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, my father had kept all these materials and he left them for me. In those boxes, my grandfather was portrayed as this monster, incredibly abusive to my father, publicly humiliating him, but also abusive to some of his workers, some of his female workers. And so I was kind of left with like this, well, why did he leave me this stuff? Because he never said anything really bad
Right.
about his father. Even though his father had done all this terrible, like basically tried to destroy his soul, he never said anything about that. But he left me all this stuff. When I'm a writer, I write books. He knows what I'm going to do with it.
Right.
And so then it's like, oh, so he really actually wanted to get revenge against his father, but he couldn't do it himself. So he wants me to do it for him. And I was like, oh, that's kind of sweet. Like he really needs me after all.
Sure.
Just for this one thing. So, yeah, I thought about it for a long time and I had a lot of different thoughts about it. But I guess in the end, I came around to feeling that, first of all, I waited so that like almost everybody in it had died. So there wasn't like a question of personal offense of someone, which is one thing. And then I thought, well, like when you write, yes, if you're writing about your family, you try to honor what you think is worth honoring, but you're not writing for dead people. You're writing for living people, and you're writing for people who haven't lived yet, but may one day find that this book helps them understand something. I think that's the reason why you write really at all. You don't write to like celebrate dead people. I mean, you can. But I just don't feel like that was what my project here was. Yeah, so, and now I have family members who I think are not that pleased with me. And anybody in any family has a writer that goes ahead and tells the story of their family. I think most people are going to be a little peeved probably at that person because everybody's story is different. I have a much older half-sister. My dad was married when he was very young and had 2 children. She was around for a lot of the stuff that I wasn't around for. So she has a somewhat different take. I have cousins that, even though the business ended and eventually it closed in 1975 and the buildings were torn down, in the 80s, the children of my father's oldest brother, Belford, started a new frozen vegetable processing plant a few miles from the old one. And they're still in that business. For them, C.F. Seabrook is kind of their hero, and they don't necessarily want to hear all this negative stuff about C.F. Seabrook. And they probably want to know, although they haven't said anything to me, why was it necessary to publish this stuff? But it was necessary to me. You do get to read a lot about how American fortunes are made, and like sort of like a self-help how-to guide to like how if you work like this hard and maybe you can do it too. But there is like usually like another story to those stories. And it's rarely the story that's made for public consumption. But most family members, for whatever reason, don't tell that story or, and they have their reasons. But I told it, and, I think it's like a kind of an interesting other side of a classic American success story that maybe actually has parallels with other classic American success stories.
No, that makes sense. I had not thought about that, but it is as if you received your commission from your father from beyond the grave by him giving you all of this information. And it's an interesting take that you felt that you could help your father by writing the book.
But in the end, it was really helped me understand him better by processing how difficult this must have been for him and how it forced him because you're in a situation where your father, who is your great hero, your boss, your landlord, like your everything, has decided that he hates you and wants to destroy you. Most people wouldn't even survive that situation. And I think the only way he survived it was to become kind of like closed off and not to feel a lot of things. That was how he comported himself in the world and with me. And I never really kind of understood why until I realized just how horrible his father had been. So for me, I ended up closer to my dad in the process of writing this story than I
Yeah.
ever had been before. And even though he wasn't around to, share that with, it's definitely been therapeutic for me.
That was going to be my next question is, had you been able to attain a degree of closure, or a degree of relationship building that you were pursuing in the writing of the book?
For sure. I mean, I talk about alcohol too, and the alcohol always played a huge role in the Seabrooks' rise because that was another way that we sort of proved that we were sophisticated and could drink with sophisticated people. But it was always like having a loaded gun around. If you don't know how to use it properly, you can get hurt. And a lot of people did get hurt by alcohol in my family, including me. And it was kind of seeing like why I drank and what that had to do with my father, and how it was both a wish to sort of find communion with my dad, but also like a medical way out of that, just like medicating myself
Yeah.
at the dinner table to just get through. Like now I understand it. Something about writing, like putting everything in an order, you can kind of create this thing that is greater than the sum of the parts. It's a therapeutic kind of thing, I think.
Yeah.
It makes sense. It gives meaning to events that maybe didn't have meaning before, and there's some comfort, I think, in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that your grandfather was part of employing many of the Japanese Americans as they came out of internment camps. That's definitely a scar on the history of the American government and how that was handled. You mentioned this phrase, a Japanese phrase of shikata ga nai,
Right.
which translates to "it cannot be helped. Nothing
Right.
can be done about it." It almost comes with this connotation of, okay, life is unfair. Now
Right.
let's get back to work. And you
Okay.
even mentioned that there are some of these people that are now in their 90s that have lived through those things, and they still look very positively back on that season. It was a challenge for me personally to think about, to what degree do I have that Shitaka Ganai mentality versus looking at every possible transaction, every possible opportunity. Am I being taken advantage of? It was just a conviction for me of, these people suffered through a lot of stuff, and now in their 90s, they are not captive to bitterness. They are not captive to anger. They actually, the needle has swung towards thankfulness, even in some of these
Right.
bad situations. Again, not removing any way, shape, or form, removing that it shouldn't have happened. That's not what I'm pointing to. I'm pointing to the impact of that mindset on the life of the person that chooses to take that mindset. And I just wanted to get what your thoughts are in that area as you've interacted with these Japanese Americans, as you go on the book tour, as you go back to Seabrook Farms and meet with some of these people.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese American experience at Seabrook and how history has played out since then. Actually, the museum itself was created in 1994 with money from reparations during the Reagan era. The government paid $20,000, I think it was, to any family member who was incarcerated in one of those camps. Some of the Seabrookers, as they call themselves, used that money to build the museum. So that was actually a really interesting kind of like going from one of the worst crimes committed against American citizens in U.S. history, really a horrible thing, and then this positive thing could come out of it. For the people who endured that hardship, the parents who came, that was very meaningful. And the fact that the museum tells that story and will continue to tell that story gave a lot of meaning to them. But I think for the kids like me, they were some frustration in not getting their parents to actually talk about the hardships that went on, when they knew very well that it existed, and they knew very well that it had an effect on their parents, and that they'd been depressed, they'd been even traumatized by a very traumatic experience. And those traumas often can show up in the way they treat their children and even the way you treat your children. I mean, they don't just disappear. And in some ways, like this whole mythologizing of the experience just made it harder to get at the truth. So while I understand the need for it, and I do see that it is given comfort to people, particularly that generation, and also, that generation was also like the Depression era. My mother came of age in the Great Depression, and her attitude was get back to work and stop complaining about it. A lot of those folks think that the younger generation just complains too much, or like they're traumatized about everything, and they have this anxiety about all this stuff, and it would be better if they didn't have to feel that way. I don't know, that could be true. That's one of the most interesting things about the book is you've got like people who have very different takes on this one man.
Yes.
And like almost diametrically opposed takes. Like this guy literally saved the life of this person too. This guy tried to destroy my father in every way except actually killing him. How do you reconcile those two things? You don't really. You just sort of live with that doubt or with those 2 points of view, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. A friend of mine and I have talked about things like this, where an event happens, there's a lot of perspectives on it. What seems to happen, this is totally anecdotal and just observational, but what seems to happen is that the opinion that's in existence as the event is happening, whether it be slightly positive or slightly negative, over time, it just exaggerates in that direction. Somebody with a slightly positive experience with a boss or a company or whatever, 20 years later, the rose-colored glasses are more than they were.
Right.
And when they have a slightly negative experience, it's interesting because you're talking, and we're talking about a family that is now, we're 70 years from some of these events.
Yeah.
And you say it's a diametric experience where somebody's like, this is the most evil situation that ever happened, or this thing was the most amazing thing. It falls into that model of time doesn't change your opinion, it exaggerates your opinion almost in some lenses.
Yeah.
John, it has been so good to sit down and spend some time with you. I appreciate you taking the time and chatting, and I definitely appreciate you falling into the dress code for Grody and Unprofessional, which is to come right in from the yard work, covered in grass clippings with the T-shirt. You are completely on brand.
Excellent.
Talked about your father with the English suits, and I was a little nervous you were going to have like a beaver pelt or something very fancy on. So no, you fit the mold perfectly.
I got my grass clippings, right? I've just been weed whacking, so yeah, I could have probably cleaned up a little bit more. But
no, that's great.
All right, Justin. Good to talk to you. Take care.
For those that wish to share praise, feedback, accolades, or large sums of money, you can reach me at justin@grody.io. For those with complaints, concerns, frustrations, or accusations, or if you're planning to write a tell-all book about me 7 decades after my death, you can reach me at my future email, notra@l.com. Thanks for your time. Let's do this again soon.